Hello and welcome to the New York Society Library, in person or on screen. Thank you so much for joining us. A few of us are here in the library's building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So as we begin, we acknowledge that our building stands on traditional lands of the Lenape people and other indigenous peoples to whom we offer gratitude and respect at this time. If you're new to the New York Society Library, we were founded in 1754 and is New York City's oldest ongoing cultural institution. We're proud to continue as a fully independent library with a thriving community of readers, writers, and families. In addition to our large collection of books and other materials, beautiful reading spaces, children's library, and other services, we offer a full season of events with authors and other presenters, so do take a look at what's coming up. This library is in the early stages of a multi-year project in collaboration with Folio, the Seattle Athenaeum, who may have some folks joining us today, to highlight and celebrate books by Indigenous writers, both historical Native writers in the library's collections and the diversity and vibrancy of Native writers being published in many genres today. We invite you to take a look at either of our websites to learn more and check out our lists of recommended reading. By happy coincidence, we have another event with a writer from an Indigenous background coming up this Monday, June 22nd. Greg Saris on his new novel, The Last Human Bear, his only Manhattan event on the book. It's free, public, and hybrid, so you're welcome to join us then as well. It's a pleasure to have with us today three terrific creators, Weyodi OldBear, Lee Francis IV, and Patty Krawec. Ms. OldBear is a citizen of the Comanche Nation and an award-winning Indigenous futurist, author, poet, game developer, and Nebula Award finalist. Her novel, As Many Ships as Stars, released in October of 2024, received warm reviews from Publishers Weekly. Her short story, Red Lessons, was the winner of the National Imagining Indigenous Futurism Prize. She also has substantial credits in the comics world, including The Clock, for which she was nominated for a Zelda Award. Her latest book, The Root and the Seed and the Thief in Between, is brand new this month from Android Press, and you can buy it via the direct publisher link in the chat. Dr. Francis is joining us today from his home in North Carolina. He has founded various Native and Indigenous pop culture related organizations, such as the Indigenous Comic-Con, Indigenous Worlds of Wonder, the Indigenous Futurism Festival, Native Realities, and Red Planet Books and Comics. He is also an award-winning writer and editor, has published multiple works from poetry to short stories to comics, and served as a host and lead writer for Indigenous, I love this title so much, on New Mexico PBS. Ms. Krawec is an Anishinaabe Ukrainian writer and speaker belonging to Lac Seul First Nation in Treaty 3 territory, joining us today from her home in Niagara Falls. Along with a background in social work and services to her communities, she's a founding director of a foundation that challenges settlers to pay their rent for living on Indigenous land and then disperses these funds for the immediate and structural needs of Indigenous people. Her first book, Becoming Kin, an Indigenous Call to Unforgetting the Past and Reimagining Our Future, was published in 2022, and her most recent book, Bad Indians Book Club, came out last September. You can buy her books via the link in the chat or at your favorite indie bookstore. I'm honored to hand the floor to our panelists. Thank you.
Marawika, Nanani at Weyodi Wurataka, Nanamana Sopni, Nathana Albuquerque, Naganibite. My name is Weyodi OldBear. I am a Comanche woman. I come from Lawton, Oklahoma, where my tribe is based, and currently live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Lee?
I'll go. Yeah, that's great. So, Gwatsi Hapa, Jawashrap, Wahindame Lee Francis, Washesh Gowekame, Americaname. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lee Francis. I also go by Dr. Indigenerd. And my family's from the Pueblo of Laguna, from the village of Weyodi that we call Quishchi at home. Currently I live in North Carolina. I'm a Pueblo immigrant to the North Carolina tribal lands and communities, just ecstatic to be here with some amazing friends and chatting.
Yeah. Well, Anin Bujo, Wabnana and Gonkwe Indigenous Adik and Dodum, Obishkokang and Dunjaba, Niagara and Dunjaba, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Kwe, and Dao. I pay taxes under the name of Patty Krawec. I live here in Niagara. My reserve is, as was said earlier, Lac Seul First Nation, which is, you get to Thunder Bay, turn right. When you run out of road, that's where Lac Seul is. It is absolutely stunning up there, and it's a long drive. It's a good 3 days. It's like I could either drive 3 days and be in Florida, or I could drive 3 days and still be in Ontario, or I could. So Laxel, Ontario is like massive and huge. I really enjoyed my time with the New York Society Library last year. I think we were in conversation about my book becoming kin. And when Lee and Weyodi and I were talking Indigenous futurisms, Lee is actually the first conversation I had back when Carrie and I were podcasting under Medicine for the Resistance that got me thinking about Indigenous utopic vision.
Hmm.
And that conversation and then a subsequent conversation with Daniel Heath Justice just really transformed my vision. And that's what I'm on about in Bad Indians Book Club. That's what I'm on about in social media, is just how powerful Indigenous visions are.
Hmm.
And so it's really cool to be, sort of in Lenape-Hoking. We were actually just talking about the N.K. Jemison's book, The City We Became, which I just finished reading. It's so good. But there's an amazing line in here that's spoken by the woman who becomes the Bronx, and she's Bronca, she's Lenape herself. And she says, imagining a world creates it if it isn't already there. That's the great secret of existence. It's super sensitive to thought. Decisions, wishes, lies, that's all you need to create a new universe. Every human being on this planet spins off thousands between birth and death. And that's such a native way of thinking. And
Hmm.
if we have that power, and one part of the world is creating these terrible dystopic futures,
Hmm.
and then our vision, because as Lee pointed out to me all those years ago on that podcast, the apocalypse is in our rearview mirror. It happened. Parts of it are still ongoing. Like it's not over.
Right.
But
Yeah,
that's what frees us to have a different vision of the future. And so if imagining worlds creates them,
Hmm.
anyway, that was just a really neat thing for me to read and to come across, especially reading it, the day before this conversation.
No, absolutely. I had written down all these points on note cards, which I, of course, left in New Mexico. But that was my final note card, that we have to imagine the future in order to make it happen. We can't make a world that we haven't imagined. So
Right.
we have to imagine differently. And how do you imagine differently? You imagine differently by beginning with a different source, by having a different point of view. And, that's one of the big problems that, in the end, I think that maybe the root of all culture war is one, a desire for monoculture on the one side,
Mm.
and a desire for a bunch of seats at the table and multiple perspectives on the other.
Hmm.
And I think monoculture is one of the most deadly things you can have, no matter what that culture is. Because you only have one perspective. And if it's the perspective that caused the problems in the first place, nothing is going to get fixed. You're only going to, you can't. The master's tools will not destroy the master system. We know that. You have to have a different point of view if you want to build a different future.
Yep.
But we're beginning at the end. What is Indigenous futurism? Of course, everything goes in a circle, so that's
I was about to say, I was
all right.
like, I don't know if we're beginning at the end. We're beginning
At the
we're
end,
ending at the beginning. We're beginning in the middle. Who knows? Um,
it's all a circle.
I think
We're
me
wizards. We
too.
begin wherever we begin is the beginning.
That is correct. And I think
It,
it's interesting to as we frame it that way too, because that is a rooted principle within indigenous philosophies, but also a guiding binding principle about indigenous futurisms, that parallel. I think it's one aspect in avenue. Um, throwing that the first teaser of the definition out there, I think, is that it's essentially a um, of a future perspective through multimodal expressions that allow for indigenous presence to perpetuate and permeate the future in dynamic and authentic ways.
Yes,
So
but I
that
mean,
we
this is because,
build off of that.
but we could contrast that with a future that we're often presented with or sold, that's just a white future. There's just white people, and
Yes.
everything
Yes.
is through a very European lens.
Yes.
And that's limiting. And you could say in the smallest possible way that an indigenous future is one where other people exist,
Yes.
Because I know as an indigenous person, as a citizen of the Comanche Nation, I don't want to go forward, not just with myself, but with my, not just with, I want a future with Comanches in it, and I want my Black friends in it, and I want my Kiowa friends, and I want my Pueblo friends. That's an indigenous future, because we were never just one culture. We were never just one people. It's like a mosaic.
Yeah.
As opposed to being just that one thing.
That was the second conversation that we had with Daniel Heath Justice about futurisms. And he pointed out, so he got me looking, because he says, like, where are we? Where are we in the future? Do we exist at all? And when you look at, a lot of the futurist books and like even N.K. Jemison's book, a very central, important character is a Lenape woman living in the Bronx. And the fact that she's Lenape and that she becomes the Bronx, embodies the Bronx, is critical to, kind of the success of everybody. They're always, we're always on quests, right? So in stories, there's problem to solve. That is critical to the success. And she herself is not Lenape. So she had Lenape people guiding her on how she presented that character. But Daniel said, like, where are we? Do we exist? And it was like right after we had that conversation, I read American War by Omar Al-Akkad, which is a brilliant book set in the future, set in a future of post-Civil War America, and we weren't in it. We weren't there.
Right.
And so I tweeted out, this was when I was still on Twitter. So I tweeted out, like, did I miss him? Did I miss us? Like, where are we not there? Like, do we not exist? And I tagged him. And that was the start of some really cool conversations between us, which actually wound up with him. Actually, I referenced the conversation in Bad Indians Book Club with his permission. And then he actually referenced it. He wrote the foreword for Bad Indians Book Club. And he references it in the foreword. Because his response was really thoughtful. It was like, you're right. That's really good feedback. Thank you. And it got him thinking because, like, we're not, and if we are in the future, now thinking of Star Trek, like, what are we? We're Chakotay? Like, come on. Like, I remember being really excited about Chakotay and then also being really horrified by Chakotay.
or were the time phasing magical natives
Yes.
that then adopt Wesley Crusher to be
That's right.
our token time phasing native with us.
Yeah.
Well, that's always, you have to have the magic white boy to be your avatar, I guess. But I mean, this is the thing.
So to
That was my
speak.
second point. This is my second point. Native representation is horrible. I mean, it still hasn't caught up anywhere with where it ought to be.
Yep.
And the problem is that the image that non-native people have in Europe, in the US, in Canada, all really boils down to the fantasy of one 19th century German who never traveled west of Buffalo. And Karl May, and he was so wildly popular that Euro-Americans who could have interacted with actual Indians or spoken to any native nation prefer to really base their work on the work of Karl May. And you see it, the depiction that you see in Westerns of Indigenous people, the depictions up to this very day, I mean, even something like Dances with Wolves is very Karl May influenced. And you see it there, it's the picture that a lot of non-natives are carrying around in their head, all come from this German. And there's like eugenic stuff in it, and there's all kinds of real squirrely ideas that he was baking in to the image and stories of Indigenous people that aren't really the stories of Indigenous people, but are really about the stories that people from a European background tell each other about us. So, or themselves.
Yeah. Well, and then horror actually comes out of that Western tradition. I heard Callie Simmons and Shawano Chad Urin talking about Western as the foundation for contemporary horror. And I was riveted because I had never thought about that before. But like all of them are, about the terrifying other who's threatening the nice white suburban landscape. And then you've got Prey, where you've got oh, and I forget I forget what tribe she was from. The young woman in Prey. But anyway, she takes on the predator with her own skills and her own abilities because he is just one more invader with advanced weapons. And she is not mystical, magical native, vibing with nature. And no, she's like a person in her own right with her own skills, approaches things a little unconventionally within her tribe because she's a woman trying to do a man, what's, typically a man's role. But that's also okay. Like that's not terrible. My kid reminded me of that as I was writing Bad Indians Book Club. And I was just so happy to like, oh yeah, I got to include that because that was just such a good example of an Indigenous person driving the show. Because behind the camera, that was a Blackfoot person driving the movie. And so when we tell our stories, whether it's horror or futurisms, and I think those overlap a lot, they're different because our experiences are different. And I think they offer a lot more in terms of how we survive what's going on right now. Because more borders and more military and more policing are not keeping anybody safe. They're just making people more dangerous. And we did not live with borders and military and policing. We found ways to get along. We didn't always get along, but we found ways. We found ways to deal with it without completely eliminating each other.
So let me throw this
I have to jump in because Jane Myers, the producer of Prey, she's Blackfoot and Comanche.
Thank you. I knew she was Blackfoot and something, but I couldn't remember the and something.
She's also Comanche. My great-great-grandmother delivered her great-great-grandmother.
Oh, cool. So yes, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I knew she was Blackfoot and something.
She's Comanche. That's why it was a Comanche setting.
Oh, okay, there we go. I had just read it this morning too, that chapter, but obviously my brain wasn't holding information. So your turn, Lee, before we keep talking.
Well, I was going to just sort of like throw out there that there's still a particular notion, that exists in a lot of these framings, even when our folks are part of the storytelling and the behind the cameras and whatnot, because there's only so far that the Western white audience is going to accept things, right? So whereas you have this one step in Prey it's still this primitive notion of native identity, right? That's where native people exist. Even when they're battling space aliens, they still
We're
exist
still in the
in
past.
the past, right? We didn't see her on the planet fighting, and although they have teased that, so if you have been watching the world they're building, they've been teasing that she may have been taken and then she's going to be on the planet fighting in the big battle royale,
Oh,
but we didn't see
really?
that when it first
Because
came out.
the new Predator was not good. I didn't like that one, the
There
newest one.
was the new one wasn't as good. The second one was better, and then but they've been teasing out that they're building a whole Predator universe and that they're collecting all of the people from the various Predator franchises and probably going to
Ooh.
have a big collaboration. So they kind of teased that she might be coming back because they plucked her from the planet. And all that being said is that there's still, I think, when we is the recognition that it is phenomenal what was done, and still in all these boundaries of, I think, what Indigenous futurisms is intention or is always trying to push out those edges. It is this idea that we are continuing to exist not as a primitive fantasy for settler colonialism to find themselves through mystical spiritual means, but rather that we do have our own agency in how we approach the futures, the world, and our own existence. Where are we? Where do we still exist in these spaces? So I think that that's one of the, like, film and television. It's always, I am a huge fan of the of Last of the Mohicans, the movie. It
Mm.
is a guilty pleasure. I know all the problems with it. I talk about all the problems with it. The source material is just a dumpster fire.
The worst.
The movie is actually pretty solid in a lot of ways, and has a phenomenal score. And I still know that it's problematic. And I think that's the part about whenever, we are showcasing any of these things, especially previous to this last 5, 6 years when Native folks were not behind the camera, and
Mhm.
not bringing any type of influence. It was a different historical reference point. I think that's also so much factored in to the work that we are doing as Indigenous futurists, and working in the Indigenous futurism string. Sorry, my
So,
camera.
oh gosh.
There we go. I'm
Sorry,
back.
I'm now because you're talking about the limitations, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
limited by what my publisher is willing to spend money on, right?
Right.
Because your publisher takes a big risk on you.
Yep.
And so so I'm limited by what my publisher is willing to spend money on, also by what the market is willing to purchase. The market,
Yep.
I don't, Bad Indians Book Club. So Becoming Kin was written for the nice white ladies that I grew up with, who always say this isn't who we are, and it's like it's 5 chapters of receipts that yes, this is who you are, and then 3 chapters of how you can do better. But Bad Indians Book Club was written for us.
Right.
Right? It was written for my friends. It was written for
Right.
Indigenous people, for Black, for Palestinian people. Like it was written for us, for all of us who are pushed off into the margins. But there are limits to what the market will accept. And so
Mhm.
when you said that, that made me curious about all of these Indigenous Comic Cons and stuff that you've created as a space that's for us. None of
Mhm.
which I have gone to, by the way. I meant
That's all
to.
right.
But then COVID
We understand that.
happened, and then Trump happened, and there's a reason I'm Zooming instead of being in a
Exactly.
city I like. There's a reason.
Because we'd like to keep you around, not here, like, just in
I don't want to
existence.
be in some ICE
So,
facility where people forget
yeah,
my name.
exactly. Exactly. No, I think there is a limitation to it. I mean, the things that in creating all of these, it's sort of like radiating spheres of it's a spiral, right? So it's been wanting to put together a place where we can gather, where we feel comfortable and don't have to reiterate all of the past traumas, tragedies, etc., in order to educate your audience, before I can get to my point. right? I have to tell you about everything that happened in the past. Here's colonization, here's boarding school, here's how ethnocide, genocide. And it was like, oh, but now let's get to the fun stuff. I was like, well, I don't want to do that part. I just want to get to the fun stuff, right? Or the uplifting stuff, or the recognition that these things have happened. And so what we create, what we put forward is more about the rekindling and renewing of the spirit than it is about dwelling in a tragic narrative that continues to be foisted upon us in order to keep us trapped. It's a horror film, right?
Yeah,
Our
it really
own
is. It
trauma
really is.
is the trapping, and it's the stripping. It's the final stripping that I always say is like the most insidious work was they cut our hair, they took the land, they took our language, and then they took the imagination. And
Yeah.
so many folks in these spaces. So even something like Comic-Con, Weyodi can talk about this in a sec. But with Comic-Con, I was like, cosplay, natives doing cosplay in whatever they want, be it a native character or non-native character, because we also have to, much like yours, is when we're talking to our own folks, we also have to recognize that we are consumed and trapped in this space. And so we have to create or locate spaces where we don't have to conform into those colonial capitalist colonial boxes that tell us this is the only way that we can choose to exist.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that for me was always, the piece what I was creating is like I always write for my kids. I write for Native kids. I
Mhm.
write for my kiddos.
That's
They're
like
my
Toni
first
Morrison, who
audience.
said she writes for Black people. That's who she writes
Yep.
for. If white people are going to buy it, that's cool, but that's
Cool.
not who she's writing for.
Yep.
But it made me think about the Buffalo Hunter and how he's trapped. The central character is
Hmm.
trapped in his trauma,
Yep.
literally.
Yep.
But Weyodi, when Lee was talking, and I'm kind of falling into interviewer mode, but sorry, all these years of podcasting die really hard.
Right.
But as Lee was talking about that stuff and trapped in our trauma and everything, that made me think of the two pieces of your work that I included in Bad Indians Book Club. Wowoken
Yeah.
and
Mm.
I just
Ambitious
spaced on the name
Sisters.
of it, the spaceship stealing Comanche, because you reach back into the trauma, but you don't stay there and you don't even really investigate it. You just use it to launch off into the future in really cool ways.
Mhm.
And so I think people would just like to hear about that because,
Mhm.
and again, I can't believe I'm spacing on the title. But you know the title, so you can talk about it because I just loved that story from the minute I started reading it. I just loved it so much. Spaceship
Well,
stealing Comanche.
Yeah, well, it was really about, I have to digress because everything I do is a digression. It's all based, Comanche language makes you digress all the time. And we were talking, my cousin was going, my boss says I can never tell a straight story. I can be 5 minutes late and then I spent 20 minutes explaining why I was 5 minutes late. And he's pointing at me now. But I became a writer because I came home from school at Thanksgiving around in November because we had the school Thanksgiving play, and they made me wear a little band, a little construction paper band with a feather in the back, and I was explaining excitedly all about the Indians. I had no idea they were talking about us. And my aunt, who is, I lived with my grandparents. My aunt is like 10 years older than I am. And she was like, what? We haven't even realized they're talking about us. And I was like, no, that couldn't be. That has nothing to do with us. And then she had to bring my grandmother in and said, do you hear what this child, she was like 14. Do you hear what your granddaughter is saying? She just loved to tell me. And I was explaining this whole thing to my grandmother. She said, yes, they're talking about us. And I was like, they have no idea. That's completely wrong. Everything they're saying about us is wrong. And she said, yeah, yes, I know, but they're not going to listen. And I said, well, you need someone who's to make them listen. And she said, they won't. I said, I'm going to make them listen.
Mhm.
When I grow up, I'm going to make them listen to our real stories and who we really are. And she said, okay, you do that. And, basically. But I was like, no, I'm really gonna do it. And then so I really have always wanted to be a writer, I've always written. And as I became an adult, I realized she was actually completely right, and gatekeepers were not interested in an Indigenous history from an Indigenous point of view. And then along the way, I had also fallen in love with science fiction. And I went, I can sneak the truth in. I can sneak the real story in with spaceships under the guise of science fiction. And also, I love science fiction. I love. And so As Many Ships as Stars is basically a science fiction retelling of our oral tradition of how we first acquired horses. And I don't know what you know about Western history, but we were the first tribe to acquire horses and figure out how to use them in the West. And we got these from the Spanish, and by the 1600s we were writing all over the place, or the mid 1600s, and using horses to our advantage. And the story was that they were first seen by a small band, and there was a woman in that band that they called that She Speaks Last. And because once she said her piece, that there wasn't anything to argue with. And so, if you know Comanches, we love to argue. We loved her. Anyway, and so she said, they're stealing these people that we used to trade with, and they're making them work for them, and they're taking care of this animal, and this animal is what they're using to their benefit to subject all these people. And she said, we need to send, it's men that they're having to do this work. We need to send a bunch of young men to be captured by the Spanish. And in 1 year, they'll steal all of these animals that they can, and then they'll teach us how to use them, and we'll use them to our advantage. And that's how we became who we became. And they also, with them, they brought everyone who wanted to come, basically, because they were Nawa people, and our language is mutually intelligible with Nawa, because we're related. So that's basically the premise for As Many Ships as Stars. But instead of being horses, it's an aerospace scientist, a Comanche woman who's an aerospace scientist working on a joint public-private Mars colonization ship. And she steals one of the ships and fills it with all the people she loves. But instead of going to Mars, which is a fool's errand, and she finds incredibly stupid for a number of reasons, with scientific reasons and practical reasons, they become spacefaring people. And as they become spacefaring people, they become more who we really are. They leave aside English, they become polyamorous, which we're traditionally a polyamorous. The anthropology work is terrible because we're usually represented as being polygamous. We're actually polyamorous with a very complicated marriage system, and a very complicated family structure. And we go back to that family structure. We go back to being matrilocal. We are matrilocal. They within their spaceships, and in that very indigenous sense of relatedness and wanting to be related, they develop a mitochondrial drive for their ships, so that our ships are our relatives. And we're not separate from our technology. We're not separate from our environment. It's part of us. There's not us and then this wilderness out there. No, we're all related. It's a relationship, not this foreign thing. So that's As Many Ships as Stars in a nutshell. Wogan is included in an anthology called A Howl that Lee was behind. Lee and Beth Lepense were behind. And Wogan is a comic, it's in comic form, it's a comic book anthology. And it's all about werewolves. And Wogan means barker or barking. Barks in Comanche. And I was always brought up with the idea that a brave warrior who really does something in his, brave for the people, in his next life, he'll be a coyote, he'll return as a coyote. And my idea is this guy accidentally does something brave. And he comes back as just the saddest, most kind of embarrassing coyote to the other coyotes. He's like this, we're ashamed of you, my guy. Why are you even here? And it actually retells a story that my grandmother would tell as one of her biggest traumatic events of her childhood. That in our town, there was a black man who had worked for this old white lady whose relatives were ignoring her and taking care of her, and she had left him her property in her will. And the leading citizens of the town lynched him. And they were looking for his family to make sure that they did not inherit the property. And her and our at the mission, because the Klan controlled Oklahoma at that time. The Klan completely controlled the politics of Oklahoma in the 20s and 30s. So we had to be at mission. Most Comanches were attached to missions for their own safety, whether they had converted to Christianity or not. So at the Dutch Reform Mission, where my family were living, they hid this man's wife and children. And they hid them in the root cellars. And then had to play dumb when the Klan came looking for them because they thought maybe, because this guy had relationships with Indian people. He was friends with a lot of Indian people. And that's why his family came. So that really was the inspiration. And who doesn't want to see a werewolf fight the Klan? So
It's like when the Predator took out all the French fur traders. It was like, that was a beautiful moment. I was like, yay, Predator!
I wanted to have that beautiful moment where a werewolf, because this coyote decides that he has human being powers, which is, like people would talk about, I have bird medicine. He says, I have human being medicine. I have the power to turn into a human being and use the attributes of a human being. And of course the other coyotes are like, that is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. Who wants to have human being powers? And that's why I kind of flipped it around. And so he uses his, that self against these bad guys in the story, but to read the rest of it to see how it all goes down. But that's basically, I wanted to turn this traumatic thing that my grandmother would always talk, she was like, she said, I stuttered for a year after that. I was so scared that those people, those men were going to get our friends that were down in the root cellar. And I was scared that they were going to get my dad, because her father went and talked to him and acted just as dumb as he possibly could. But he did get them to go away. And the family did survive. So, but they lost their father. So I wanted to rewrite it into give it a happier ending. Think about, because when we're united, it's one of my personal because I'm not gonna pretend, it's one of my personal pet hates. It's one of my personal pet hates is anti-blackness within Indigenous communities.
Yep.
And anti-Indigenous in Black communities, you get it both ways. And I'm like, guys, they're winning. This is just what, this was the plan.
Yeah. Well, it
This is
goes
the
to
plan
that
for us.
kind of, single story. Like you said, when you were talking about your experience in school and, you were horrified that, wait, but everything they think about us is wrong. And so
Yeah.
we know that everything that they think of, that, white stream society thinks of us is wrong.
Oh
And yet somehow we believe what white stream society tells us about Black people, about, people from the, the South Asian continent, about people from Mexico. Like somehow we find, like, why do we not very quickly assume, well, if they're lying about us, they must be lying about everybody, which is why I wrote, because Bad Ideas Book Club came out of a podcast series, right? It came out of a question that a friend of mine asked about how can I understand more about what Indigenous people think about things. And I'm like, holy crap, that's a ginormous question. Because we, like, even just in this room, we think a lot of things about a lot of things. And so I wound up coming up with this like whole year-long reading list of very different, and people. And then in the conversation we had about history, Taya Miles was part of that conversation. She writes a lot of Afro-Indigenous, a lot of Afro-Cherokees.
yeah.
That woman has written more books than Stephen Graham Jones, I think, which is really saying something.
That's a lot.
Um,
That's a lot.
but she got me looking for the gaps. The gaps, because she said that there were gaps in Black
Gaps.
studies where Native people should be. And there are gaps in Native studies where Black people should be. Because our histories are so entwined. They're so entwined.
Yes.
And so then that just changed the trajectory of the whole podcast series because now I was looking for Black authors, I'm looking for other marginalized authors, Palestinian authors and Mexican authors. I'm looking for all kinds of other authors to put into conversation because, we reading from the margins takes us takes us to better futures. It takes us to better worlds.
Yes.
It's, if we can imagine worlds into being, like Branca says in the N.K. Jemison's book, like I'm still thinking about that. And what a huge, because she's drawing on her Lenape heritage, right? Which NK had people looking into. And so I'm taking that as a Lenape teaching. In part because of that's the sensitivity and stuff that she had going on with creating that character, but also because as I'm reading traditional Ojibwe stories, and right now my whole blog, thousandworlds.ca, is looking at these stories that were documented in 1906. So these stories that were kind of documented and then kept in a box until the 70s or 80s. And so they haven't evolved. They haven't become Christianized, like they have kind of been, and so it's a really neat lens into what my ancestors thought about, the stories that they told. So when I look at that way of understanding the world and really the quantum physics nature of the Anishinaabe mind and the Anishinaabe stories, it's completely consistent with what Branca says in N.K. Jemison's beautiful work of fiction, that there are many universes branching off, and that, I mean, she goes on to say that our existence isn't, and like Weyodi, you talked about kind of talking in circles, that our existence isn't this linear here to there. Our existence is falling through all of these different universes, and so it's very three-dimensional. It's not like this linear front to back. And it's cyclical and it's a much different way. And I think it gets us to much different places in terms of how we want society to be organized, how we want our worlds, the worlds in which we live, the worlds in which we raise our children. I have a grandson, so I'm thinking about the world that he's going to live in. I think our stories, whether they're fiction or nonfiction or traditional stories or evolved traditional stories, they contain so much possibility for how we can live better in this world. And in one, I don't know, I came across one thing is that, like as you had said earlier, Lee, about there's only so much that the market's willing to take, or that the risks that publishers are willing to take,
Right.
because this white stream market that has been created really lacks imagination. There's a
Right.
single story that they just keep telling over and over and over again. And I
It's
think
true.
our stories, and Indigenous to me is a global conversation. It's not just
Mhm.
Indigenous to the so-called Americas. And so these Indigenous stories are really the best way to break out of that single story that just keeps getting told over and over again. And I get that it's comforting. My guilty pleasure is the X-Files. I know it's propaganda. I know that it's, problematic in like so many ways. Especially the native reprepresentation is just
Mhm.
Oh my.
ridiculous.
Oh,
Well,
But I
and the,
love, I love this. I love and I watch it so many times, but we can't let ourselves get stuck just because
I,
a story is
yeah.
comfortable.
and I think what happens is when we talk monoculture, it's this
Yeah, I
essential
wrote
is
that down
it's what
actually.
capitalism does, right? It's that, it's the essentialization to just few characteristics that end up defining the entire cultural space. And so that's the double-edged sword, or the trap, right? The trap is that as a writer and artist, knowing that that's what an audience is going to want, I would like to be a successful writer, so therefore I'm going to give the audience what they want. And by doing that, I reinforce that for myself and my community, that this is what the monoculture is supposed to look like. Even if I'm trying to, like, maybe I'm teasing out the edges, right? I'm still part of that capitalistic endeavor that we call publishing, that essentializes, or media that essentializes those particular spaces. And oftentimes it brings those spaces down to, really talking about the nativeness, and really focusing on the nativeness, um, and not the people that are a part of that world that has been created. Because as you were talking, what it reminded me of, you know like, a lot of things end up being very, the as much as we're trying to get information out there, so where are we in the future, some of the stuff ends up, because of the monoculture typing, end up becoming really addict, right?
Yeah.
So,
Lee, you're freezing.
I wasn't sure if that was me or Lee, but at least he looks very pensive and thoughtful.
You speak like that.
Yeah,
can
he
you hear
look
me again?
that's a very you have like a very pensive and thoughtful frozen moment. Oh, he's
Oh,
gone
no,
now.
no.
Oh no, he's gone. Oh no, he's gone. Actually, yeah, I wrote that thing down that you said, Weyodi, about monoculture, because tomorrow I'm going to be zooming into an independent bookstore to talk with Claire Foreman about her book, Scapegoat, which is about the way we talk about invasive plants. And the whole kind of colonial imperial language about what belongs, what doesn't belong, instead of looking at how have you entered the land well? Like that's the epigraph that I have for Bad Indians Book Club, is that it's not about blood, and it never has been. This is Natalie Diaz. It's about how you enter the land and build relations. And then it's about how you welcome others. And I love that Claire, who's not native, kind of takes that approach to the way we talk about plant life. And so that made me think, monoculture is dangerous, whether we're talking about people or publishing or politics
Hold.
and immigrants or plants, like monoculture. And that's the world that's trying to be born right now in the US. And I don't know why Canada is stupid, but we wait for you guys to mess stuff up and then we do it. So we're not doing it yet. We'll just wait for you guys to mess it up and then we'll try to do it ourselves. I have no idea why Canada's like that. But that
Once we make it really bad,
ethnic
you can follow us.
monoculture is exactly what is being built politically. And that's
Yeah.
really scary. And that makes our work in the work of marginalized writers, many of whom are Indigenous or Indigenous to someplace else and have been displaced to this place,
Yeah. Well,
so
and that's a,
critical to an alternative vision of what could be. So critical because you're not going to find that alternative vision in white stream writing, right? Like you talked about earlier, you said one of you had said, and I don't remember which one, Weyodi, that they're not going to want to read an Indigenous history unless it's
Yeah.
written by a white woman. Everybody
Yeah.
loves that one that was written by a white woman, and I love it. It's a good book,
Right. Yep.
but she's not Native.
Nope.
So she's telling an
Yeah.
Indigenous people's history, but she's not Native. There
Mhm.
are a lot of Native people writing Native history books. David Truer, Nick Estes, Dino. Like, there's so many of us. I wrote one. Like, there's so many of us writing broad histories, cult tribally specific histories. You don't need to read one written by a white woman, even though it actually was a good book. But read history written by the people who lived it, not by the
Mhm.
people who observed it from the outside.
Mhm.
Sorry, rant over.
No, but and this is also, I mean, my vision for myself of what I wanted sort of evolved over time, partially because of that focus on Indigenous people as specifically Indigenous people to the Americas as sort of museum exhibits. And
Right.
oh, you should write your tribe's history. You know so much about your tribe's history. I'm like, well, yeah, I was raised by old people and I do know a lot of my tribe's history, but I'm like, I'm really more interested in my tribe's future. I am fascinated. Our history is important to us because that informs our future, but my tribe's future
Mhm.
is way more important to me. What we're going to do in the future. And how we can shape everything and change everything. I mean, and a lot of the fact that the historical imaginings about us are so wrong, is part of it. That thought that we were so primitive. We're primitive. That makes me crazy. And that makes me annoys the hell out of me. So, I mean, which kind of adds to the desire for science fiction and blasters and space helmets and all those things, but also they're fun. Let us be honest. Let me be honest. It's fun to me.
It is fun.
I want to have fun, and I want to talk about culture, and I want to talk about politics because there is no apolitical art.
Right.
It doesn't exist. It's a myth. If it supports the status quo is a political position. Supporting the status quo is a political position. Everything, it doesn't exist. So I want to talk about all those things. And I don't know, it's kind of funny. The book that I have that's coming out in 10 days is After Great Struggle and Triumph. It really doesn't overtly, it has Native characters, and it also has Hispanic characters and Black characters and, and a crabby old Jewish atheist. We have a lot of, it's got a lot of different characters, but they never talk overtly about people's Indigenous cultures. It simply informs the book. It informs the decisions that people make. It shapes the book rather than going. It's kind of funny because I wrote it before As Many Ships as Stars, and I was very careful because I was like, I don't want to be. This is a Native book. I want this to just be a book that has Native characters and has a Native lens, an Indigenous lens, and deal with Indigenous issues like the manipulation of our fertility, like
Mm.
residential schools. I don't go, oh, this is a big Native issue. No, it just happens. We talk about residential school experiences, and we talk about corporations kind of taking up a lot of that slack as far as
Mm.
government manipulation and government attempts at using Indigenous people in different ways. that
Mhm.
corporations taking up that slot. So, but the story doesn't change.
Were we supposed to
Anyway,
leave time for questions?
we should.
I don't know.
We'll talk indefinitely.
Because it's 4 o'clock, and I don't know if we're supposed to be done at 4 o'clock or if we were supposed to leave time for questions.
There's no hard and fast rule, but we could include some questions.
Some questions. I think we can we go back to the circle, to the beginning of the circle again and say?
This is the ending.
No,
This is the beginning. This is the end of the
this is the
beginning.
This is the beginning.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Questions, anybody in the room? Yeah.
Want to get couple of books that you would recommend reading, whether you wrote them or not, or if you did write them, enough times.
Well, Patty's Bad Indian Book Club is basically
What's it called?
Bad Indian Book Club.
Bad Indian book.
Is basically an exploration of lists of books, and that's my great grandmother's elder sister on the cover. Wanaka Parker.
And it's written by,
Patty Krawec.
thank you. And what's it about?
It's basically a reading list and an exploration of books on that reading list in books by various Indigenous authors who are breaking out of colonial bubbles. How's that, Patty? Is that good?
Yeah,
really
I mean,
good.
it's also
That was right
it's
on.
also like there's a lot of Black authors. There's a couple Palestinian. It's really about the importance of reading marginalized writers. Just kind of like I said earlier, like how critical that's going to be to our survival as a species, to
Mhm.
understand each other and to know each other. And so I just kind of look like, what do we write? How do we look at history differently? How do we do science differently? Because we do science differently. We approach science differently. What about gender? Our thoughts on gender. What if when memoir, when we tell our own stories, how is that different? And then I look at fiction, horror, and Indigenous and speculative fiction, which was probably my favorite chapter to write. I really liked because that's like you said, Weyodi, right? Like we can look in the past and the epigraph for the story about futurisms comes from a Maori proverb that we're walking backwards into the future because we're looking to the past. It informs how we move, but we are moving forward. We're not longing for some mythical romanticized past. We're
Mhm.
taking the important lessons and bringing them into the future.
Yep.
Well, and this is the thing. I mean, the future for all of us is a dark mountain. It is an unseen. It's a dark mountain we're climbing, and what can illuminate it is art. You know.
Mhm.
So.
And
But yeah,
a lot of it is authors that I knew, that I engaged with on social media. So you're not going to see a lot of like the big names. For a little bit, I thought that we might be able to get Louise Erdrich perhaps to do the foreword. So I wound up getting some of her work in there so that she wouldn't read the book and then not see that I hadn't mentioned her at all. I do like her books. But yeah, so a lot of it isn't like the big names that you would see. It's a very relational book. It's based in conversations that I had, and it's authors a lot of whom I knew in some capacity. So not all of them, but a lot of them are authors that I knew. So anyway, I'm really happy with it. Plus, it's got
Great.
like a banger of a cover.
Yes, it does.
It's a great book, though. I mean, I read it at various stages and thought it was
That's true.
incredible,
You were one of my early readers.
So,
Lee was actually an early reader for Becoming Kin and completely transformed the book. He emailed me back saying, "Girl, you are not an academic. You need to stop it. We need more of you in this story. Why did these
That
things
was
matter to you?" And that was really transformative. And that is actually advice that I give when I do writing workshops. Is whatever
Gosh.
you're writing about, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, whether it's essays or blog posts, why does this matter to you?
I
Why
think
do you care? Because if
Mhm.
right.
if you can't articulate that, then why should anybody else care? And so, yeah, so I have so much gratitude to both of you for the roles that you played in shaping my writing.
Are there questions from the?
Thank you to all three of you for doing this talk today. That really amazing. My question actually kind of ties into Weyodi. I'm so sorry I'm mispronouncing your name, but you and Patty. When you guys are writing, how do you toe the line between enmeshment of white overarching culture and moving towards the future that you guys want to see and staying rooted in your culture and your vision for the future?
Patty, do you wanna go first?
I stay rooted through this archive of traditional Ojibwe stories and my native community. I keep returning to that and remembering that, like Toni Morrison said, she writes for Black people. They are who, my Indigenous community, specifically my Anishinaabe community, is who I am writing for. And that means that I need to stay rooted in my stories, and that keeps me grounded.
That has
For
stolen
me-
my answer. I don't even have to add more. That's literally the same answer that I was going to give. So it's bringing those stories forward for me. Same thing.
I live with my kids in a traditional Comanche household. I speak our language to my grandkids. It's kind of my original factory setting, Comanche setting, my original factory setting, so it's much more work to write a book that is like, okay, I want this to be accessible to non-natives and specifically try to write something that's more accessible, which is actually this book series that's coming out. As Many Ships as Stars was when I finished that, I was like, oh, I'm gonna let it rip and just write the Comancheist book. And I mean, I'm just writing it. I mean, it has passages in our language and it does a lot of stuff like, stuff like that. And it's not so carefully curated. It was much easier to write. It's much harder to go, well, how am I gonna translate this? So that the mainstream reader will understand it and, I'm gonna make this very palatable to them. I'm a writer, it's work, it's the craft, you do it, you learn to do that, right? You can do, I should talk to you like this, because when I turn sideways and address the screen, I go and do this terrible profile and it doesn't even look like I'm talking to you. So, but, it's part of the craft, it's, making it, translating it to a more mainstream audience. And it's funny, I go back and I read them, and they don't read that differently. It's not that much of a, difference, but yeah.
Which of your books should we read? But who would you want someone through?
I think it just depends on what you're looking for. I mean, as Many Ships as Stars is historic,
As many ships.
As Many Ships as Stars. It actually comes from a Comanche phrase when they used to say, how many Comanches are there in the 1800s? The estimate now is between 25 and 35,000 there were. And we would say, there are as many Comanches as there are stars in the sky. There's a bunch of us. We're ever growing. And so in this book, eventually there are as many Comanche ships as there are stars in the sky. Over 40,000 years, you fill up space with their Comanches flying all over the place, doing not faster than light, but interstellar travel through space folding. And there are tons of us. So that one is kind of an adventure story, but also anthropological and historical, sort of in a real Comanche sense. It talks about who we are and who we, our traditional society. So did you have your hand raised? Me? No. Oh, you just raised it. Okay, all right. And then The Root and the Seed is a very integrated story about a big group of people coming together. Everybody writes these post-apocalyptic stories where everything's already fallen apart. Well, this story actually starts in Brooklyn as before things fall apart and watches the disintegration and the rebuilding of something better through the 3-book series by a diverse collection of people.
This is by you,
Yeah, that's by me.
the root, ROOT,
The Root and the Seed.
and the
That's the first book. The second one, which is coming out in November, is The Burning Line. And the third one, next June, is The Bees Made Honey in the Rich Man's Skull.
Huh?
Oh.
Weyodi has as many books as stars.
And I'm still writing. I'm working on a new one right now.
Oh my God. I have as many ideas as stars, but I just need 5 minutes. I got to sit down and start working on some of them.
Well, you need to take a vacation so you can write. Let's see.
I do. Actually, I have friends, we've started, where we started, and then it kind of fell off, where we were getting together every Thursday to just shut up and write. But that didn't work because we all got very busy with our lives and we stopped showing up. And
Oh,
It's the hard part. Yep.
apparently you have to actually write the books in order to finish the books.
Something.
It's just rude.
life is hard.
Okay. So I thought I might just toss in, those who are joining us online, thank you for the robust conversation in the chat. And there's a lot of fandom out there for the writers present, so thank you. I hope you don't mind the person who put this in the chat, I just thought it was worth highlighting, and it's something that our speakers have spoken to. But put here, I want Indigenous futurism that isn't always putting us in opposition with settler colonialism. I want works that envision a multitude of futures that doesn't even touch on that whatsoever. So thank you, Neon Bike 42, for that comment. I just thought that was very relevant, like,
Yeah.
Mhm.
that there are works that can be in conversation with the dominant culture and then works that just don't even.
And they're just irrelevant. Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
And you know,
Mhm.
well, that's a good point. I mean, but we have our long lives where the settler culture affects us, you know? So writers are not immune to the pressures of their real lives in that way.
So, concluding thoughts, any other questions? Anything else anybody would like to toss in?
No, hey, thank you for letting us chat.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us from several different places. We appreciate it.
This was a lot of fun. I kept forgetting that there was an audience. We were just talking.
I know we were just talking. The same.
Because
I was like, oh, that's right.
Yeah, I can't see the audience, and I
Nope.
can't like the Zoom thing. I can't see that there's like 5 people logged in, or however many people are logged in, and so I just kept forgetting that
Perfect.
there even was an audience, and it was just like it was just really nice to hang out with you guys. So thank you so much, Sawyer,
Just
and
hanging out.
the New York Society Library for having
Yes.
me a second time and for hosting, for giving a home to this conversation that the 3 of us have wanted to have for a little while. So really appreciate
Yep.
you guys and the work that you're doing as well in bringing these kinds of voices forward to people. It's really,
Mhm.
really important.
Yep.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Yep.